My name is Clara Sterling. I am 32 years old, and for the last 4 years, my husband's family has referred to my independent business asset as that muddy, worthless patch of dirt in the outskirts. Last night, at a lavish anniversary dinner hosted by my mother-in-law to celebrate her family's real estate dominance, my husband slammed a legal notice on the mahogany dining table, looked me dead in the eye, and said, "Clara, we need to talk about reality. My mother is expanding the family estate, and your little scrapyard is blocking the commercial permits. Sign it over to the family trust tonight, or you can pack your bags. We don't have room for dead weight." My sister-in-law smirked over her wine glass, whispering something about how people from my background just don't understand the language of high finance. My father-in-law simply nodded, adjusting his gold cufflinks, treating my eviction like a minor corporate transaction. They wanted to clear the landscape. They wanted the quiet, artisan wife to disappear so their empire could grow. What none of them had checked, what their expensive corporate lawyers had entirely overlooked in their haste to corner me, was that the private regional bank handling their massive expansion mortgage wasn't just an anonymous institution. 2 years ago, through a confidential asset exchange, that bank's primary liquidity vault was backed by a land lease registered under my private holding company. The very ground their family mansion sits on wasn't theirs. It was a 99-year historical lease that expired the moment they defaulted on their commercial covenants. Welcome back to Silent Storm Stories, the podcast where the people who are treated like dead weight are usually the ones holding the keys to the entire house. If you've ever had your hard work diminished by arrogant people who mistook your patience for weakness, take a breath, hit that subscribe button, and let me know your thoughts in the comments. Tonight, the dinner table is empty because the bank is calling the loan. To understand how a family could look at a person and see absolutely nothing, you have to understand the dynamic of the Sterling family. My father-in-law, Richard Sterling, built his wealth in the mid-90s by buying up distressed agricultural land, zoning it for commercial development, and selling it at a massive markup. He is a man who views the world entirely through the lens of leverage. To Richard, a person is only as valuable as the assets they can bring to his table. His son, my husband David, was raised to be a smaller, louder version of his father. He wore the right suits, drove the modern European cars, and worked as the junior partner in the family firm. When David met me 4 years ago, I was managing a boutique architectural restoration yard on the outer edge of the county line. It was land that had belonged to my grandfather, a sprawling historic property filled with reclaimed timber, vintage ironwork, and ancient stone facades. To David's mother, Alina, my profession was an embarrassment. She didn't see an architectural historian preserving heritage. She saw a girl covered in sawdust, running a glorified junkyard. "Clara is a sweet girl," Alina would tell her country club friends, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness, "but she lacks the social polish required for the Sterling name. We're hoping David can guide her into a more appropriate lifestyle eventually." For 4 years, I endured the subtle, daily assassinations of my character. At family brunches, I was sat at the far end of the table, near the kitchen doors. When the family discussed their million-dollar commercial acquisitions, my input was met with polite nods and immediate subject changes. "Don't take it personally, Clara," David would say later in our bedroom, loosening his silk tie with a sigh of irritation. "My parents operate at a very high level of business. Your little yard, it's just not in the same league. You don't know what it's like to balance a real balance sheet." I never argued. I am a woman who prefers to let the numbers do the talking. While David was busy taking credit for his father's deals, I was quietly expanding my grandfather's estate. I didn't just collect old wood and stone. I studied the historical titles of the entire county. I realized that the industrial expansion zone the Sterlings were betting their entire future on was historically tied to the water rights and access easements owned entirely by my yard. But I kept that knowledge locked in my private safe. I wanted to believe my husband loved me for who I was. I wanted to believe that if I was patient, if I was supportive, they would eventually see me as an equal. I was wrong. The illusion shattered 3 months ago when the Sterlings launched their grandest project. The Meridian Ridge development. The Meridian Ridge project was designed to be the crown jewel of the Sterling Empire. It was a massive, luxury-gated community featuring 60 premium estates, a private golf course, and a commercial pavilion. To finance this multi-million-dollar dream, Richard Sterling had leveraged every single piece of property the family owned. They took out a massive commercial mortgage with the First Federal Trust Bank, using their own ancestral family mansion as the primary collateral. Everything was set, except for one crucial detail. The main access road and the primary utility pipeline for Meridian Ridge had to pass directly through the western ridge of my restoration yard. Without that strip of land, their commercial permits would be denied by the county, and their construction schedule would grind to a halt. David didn't come to me as a husband asking for a business partnership. He came to me with a trap. It started on a Thursday afternoon. I was in my workshop, restoring a set of 19th-century oak double doors, when David walked in. He looked out of place in his pristine leather shoes against the dusty concrete floor. He didn't ask how my day was. He simply laid a folder of legal documents on my workbench. "Clara, I need you to sign these quitclaim deeds," he said, his tone casual, almost dismissive. "The firm needs the western 3 acres of your property for the Meridian project. We're absorbing your yard into the Sterling Family Trust. In exchange, my mother will set up a monthly allowance for you, so you don't have to spend your days working in this dust anymore. You can finally step back and be a proper wife." I wiped the oil from my hands and looked at the documents. The deed didn't just absorb the 3 acres. It transferred the entire historical property to the Sterling Trust for a nominal payment of $10. It was a complete liquidation of my grandfather's legacy. "David," I said softly, keeping my voice level, "this land is valued at over $800,000 due to the commercial zoning updates, and the historical easements are worth double that to any developer. This contract gives me nothing." David's face hardened. The casual husband disappeared, replaced by the arrogant partner of Sterling Development. "Let's be honest, Clara. This land is just a muddy patch of dirt. It's worthless without our project. My father is doing you a favor by integrating you into the family holdings. Don't let your stubbornness embarrass me in front of my parents." "I need time to review this with my own legal counsel," I replied, closing the folder. David let out a sharp, ugly laugh. "Legal counsel? With what money, Clara? Your little yard barely clears enough to pay your assistant. Don't be ridiculous. We're having dinner at my mother's house tomorrow night. Have the signed documents ready by then. My father doesn't like to be kept waiting." When he left, the workshop was silent again. I didn't cry. I didn't panic. I walked to the back office, unlocked the vintage iron safe, and pulled out the original 1927 land charter for the region. I called my attorney, an elderly, brilliant title specialist who had managed my grandfather's affairs for 40 years. By midnight, we had discovered the fatal flaw in the Sterling Empire, a flaw so massive that it made their multi-million-dollar mortgage look like a house of cards built on shifting sand. The dining room at the Sterling Manor was a monument to a leaner's obsession with high society. Heavy crystal chandeliers cast a sharp, cold light over a table set for 12. Silverware clinked against fine porcelain, and the air was filled with the smell of expensive wine and the low, confident chatter of people who believed they owned the future. I sat in my usual place, the chair closest to the hallway, away from the warmth of the fireplace. I wore a simple navy blue dress. No diamonds, no designer labels. Across from me, David was radiating a smug energy, occasionally tapping the breast pocket of his jacket where the unsigned quitclaim deeds were waiting. Halfway through the main course, Richard Sterling set his wine glass down with a heavy, deliberate thud. The conversation at the table died instantly. "Clara," Richard said, his deep voice cutting through the room like a corporate hammer, "David tells me you had some hesitation about the paperwork yesterday. I'm sure it was just a misunderstanding of the corporate structure we are building for you." Elinor smiled thinly from the head of the table. "Of course, Richard. Clara simply doesn't realize that a project like Meridian Ridge cannot be delayed by personal sentimentality over an old workshop. We have investors from 3 different states arriving next week." I wiped my mouth with my linen napkin, folded it precisely, and set it next to my plate. "It wasn't a misunderstanding, Richard," I said, my voice quiet, completely matching the silence of the room. "I reviewed the titles. The contract you drafted doesn't integrate my asset. It liquidates it. You are asking me to give away the land that controls the entire eastern access road and utility grid for zero equity." David laughed, leaning forward, his face flushing with irritation. "Clara, stop playing lawyer. That Muddy Ridge is nothing but an empty scrap yard without our development. You should be thanking my father for clearing your family's old debts." "My grandfather had no debts, David," I replied softly. "But your firm does." The table went completely still. Richard's eyes narrowed into sharp slits. "What did you just say?" I opened my small leather handbag, pulled out a single certified document from the First Federal Trust Bank, and slid it across the long mahogany table. It stopped right in front of Richard's plate. "3 weeks ago, Sterling Development defaulted on the liquidity covenants of your $30 million construction mortgage," I explained, keeping my tone flat, as if I were reading a weather report. "To keep the loan from going into immediate foreclosure before the investors arrived, you signed a secondary emergency collateral agreement. You put the deed of this very manor up as a short-term guarantee." "How do you know about our internal banking arrangements?" David demanded, half rising from his chair, his voice shaking with sudden anger. "Because, David," I said, looking directly at my husband, "First Federal Trust Bank doesn't own the underlying liquidity vault that funds their high-risk commercial loans. 2 years ago, when the bank was restructuring, my holding company bought the historical ground leases of the entire downtown banking district. I am the primary corporate landlord of the bank that holds your debt. And at 3 p.m. today, due to your compliance failure, I bought your specific mortgage note from them. I am no longer just your daughter-in-law. I am your primary creditor." Richard's hand shook slightly as he picked up the paper. His face turned a pale, sickly gray as his eyes scanned the official corporate seal at the bottom. "Sterling Asset Management Holding LLC, Clara S. Sterling, Managing Director." This is impossible," Alina whispered, her fake social poise completely evaporating. "Richard, tell her she's lying. She runs a junkyard." "The junkyard, Alina," I said, turning to her with a calm, steady gaze, "sits on the only land in this county that has an absolute, unrestricted water easement. Your entire luxury golf course and housing project cannot draw a single gallon of water without my signed permission. You spent millions buying land, but you forgot to check who owned the water beneath it." Richard Sterling stared at the document for what felt like an eternity. The silence in the dining room was so heavy you could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hall. The illusion of their absolute dominance had vanished in less than 5 minutes. "What are your terms, Clara?" Richard asked, his voice suddenly sounding old, stripped of its corporate authority. "Dad, you're not actually negotiating with her," David shouted, his entitlement flaring up one last time. "She's my wife. Everything she owns belongs to our marriage." I looked at David, the man who had threatened to throw me out of the house just 24 hours ago if I didn't surrender my legacy. "We signed a strict prenuptial agreement before our wedding, David," I reminded him, my voice carrying a cold, final precision. "Your mother insisted on it, remember? She wanted to make sure junkyard money never mixed with the Sterling estate. You wanted a clean division of assets. Now you have it." I stood up from the table, smoothing down my dress. "My terms are very simple, Richard. Sterling Development will halt all construction on Meridian Ridge immediately. You will transfer 60% of the equity in the commercial pavilion to my restoration trust as compensation for the unauthorized grading your trucks did on my Western Ridge last week. If the transfer documents aren't signed and delivered to my attorney by Monday morning, I call the mortgage default. The foreclosure on this manor begins on Tuesday." Alina covered her face with her hands, sobbing silently. David reached out to grab my arm as I stepped away from the table, but I caught his eye with a look so cold, so entirely resolute, that his hand dropped back to his side. "Don't come back to the apartment tonight, David," I said quietly. "Your bags are already waiting for you at the concierge desk. I've decided to rezone my life, and there's no room for dead weight." I walked out of the dining room. As I stepped through the grand front doors of the Sterling Manor, the cool night air hit my face, and for the first time in 4 years, I felt like I could breathe completely. It has been 6 months since that dinner. Richard Sterling signed the equity transfer on Sunday night, 12 hours before my deadline. Meridian Ridge is currently being built, but every single commercial permit, every water line, and 60% of the retail revenue now flows directly through my holding company. The Sterlings kept their house, but they live there as tenants under a lease that I review every single year. David tried to contest the divorce, but when my legal team brought the forensic audit of his company credit cards and his signature on the fraudulent quitclaim drafts into the preliminary hearing, his lawyers advised him to settle quietly. He currently works in a small real estate office 2 towns over, earning a modest salary, entirely cut off from the family trust he used to boast about. Yesterday, I hosted the grand opening of the reclaimed Heritage Pavilion at Meridian Ridge. The elite of the state were there. I wore my favorite working boots under a tailored dark linen blazer. As I stood on the main terrace, looking out over the beautiful stone facades that my yard had supplied, Eleanor Sterling walked past the edge of the crowd. She wasn't holding court with her country club friends anymore. She was wearing a plain dress, carrying a small plate of appetizers, looking around anxiously as if she were afraid someone would recognize her. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second. She didn't smirk. She didn't whisper. She simply dropped her gaze and walked quickly toward the shadow of the exit. When you spend your life building a foundation out of solid rock, you learn to be patient with the people who build their castles out of paper. They always come begging for the stone eventually. Thank you for staying through the entire storm tonight on Silent Storm Stories. If you listen to every single word of this 40-minute account, do me a final business favor. Drop the word foundation in the comments below so I know who the true long-form listeners are. Sleep well, keep your asset sheets clean, and never let anyone else tell you your land is worthless. For the first 3 weeks after the separation, the Sterling name did not disappear from the local business papers. In fact, it grew louder. Richard Sterling was not a man who accepted defeat in the shadows, and David was not a man who understood how to live without his father's protective shadow. They realized that while I held the primary mortgage note and the water easements for the Meridian Ridge project, the local zoning board was still packed with Richard's old country club associates. On a cold Thursday morning, my assistant at the restoration yard, a young man named Toby, ran into my back office holding a freshly printed county injunction. "Clara," he said, his breath visible in the chilly morning air. "The county just issued an environmental freeze on our western border. They are claiming that our storage of reclaimed industrial iron is causing heavy metal runoff into the local watershed. They've blocked our commercial access to the pavilion." I didn't need to read the signature on the injunction to know whose hand had guided the pen. Richard was using his last piece of political leverage. If he could tie my land up in environmental litigation for the next 2 years, Vanguard Holding wouldn't be able to collect the retail revenue from the Meridian Pavilion, and the interest on the mortgage note would begin to burn through my own liquid capital. It was a classic war of attrition, a billionaire's method of starving out a smaller competitor. I picked up my desk phone and called Marcus, my head of security and logistics. "Marcus, bring the archival logs from the 1994 County Geological Survey, the ones we recovered from the old surveyor's office downtown last winter." 10 minutes later, the massive leather-bound ledger was open on my desk. When Richard Sterling had purchased the agricultural land for his original developments 30 years ago, he had paid a private environmental inspector to clear the soil reports. What he didn't know was that the inspector's original, unedited field notes, detailing a massive, pre-existing industrial diesel spill caused by Richard's own early construction company, had been preserved in the historical salvage archives I bought from the city. The runoff wasn't coming from my vintage iron. It was coming from the buried fuel tanks Richard had hidden under his own family manor's northern lawn to avoid a federal cleanup fine in 1996. I didn't call the county board. I didn't call the papers. I packed the original survey logs into my leather briefcase, walked out to my truck, and drove straight to the Sterling corporate headquarters downtown. The executive floor of Sterling Development was entirely silent when I stepped out of the elevator. The receptionist, a woman who had known me for years as the quiet daughter-in-law who brought holiday pastries, looked up with wide, terrified eyes. She didn't ask if I had an appointment. She simply buzzed the main boardroom door open. Inside, Richard and David were sitting with 3 senior partners and a team of corporate lawyers. The table was littered with maps of Meridian Ridge and draft strategies for the injunction. David stood up immediately, his face twisting into that familiar, arrogant sneer. "Clara, you can't just walk into a private board meeting. If you're here to beg for a settlement on the access road, you're 3 weeks too late. My father has the entire county board locked down." I didn't look at him. I walked straight to the head of the table, lifted my heavy leather briefcase, and dropped it right in the center of their pristine architectural blueprints. The sound was like a small explosion in the quiet room. I opened the case, pulled out the certified copies of the 1996 original inspection logs, and laid them directly in front of Richard Sterling. "Richard," I said, my voice perfectly level, completely devoid of anger. Section 8 of the Federal Environmental Protection Act states that any deliberate concealment of commercial fuel contamination carries a mandatory corporate asset freeze, alongside a personal criminal referral for the chief executive officer. The lead corporate attorney reached across the table, grabbed the document, and began to scan the pages. Within 30 seconds, the attorney's face turned an ashen white. He slowly leaned over and whispered 3 words into Richard's ear. Richard's hands tightened around his gold pen until his knuckles turned white. "Where did you get these?" he whispered, his voice cracking. "You called my yard a trash heap, Richard," I replied softly, leaning over the table. "But you forgot that a historian's job is to collect the truth that people like you try to bury. The environmental injunction you filed this morning expires in exactly 2 hours. If it is not withdrawn by noon, these original logs will be on the desk of the Federal Regional Director, along with a formal request for a forensic excavation of your home's northern lawn." David stepped forward, his voice rising in panic. "Dad, she's bluffing. You can't let her dictate terms in our own boardroom." "Shut up, David," Richard roared, slamming his open palm against the table. The entire room went frozen. Richard looked up at me, his eyes entirely hollow, stripped of the last remnants of his lifelong arrogance. "What do you want, Clara?" "A complete resignation," I said, sliding a fresh document across the table. "You will dissolve the Sterling Trust's voting shares in the Meridian Ridge project. Vanguard Holding takes full management control. David will be terminated from the firm immediately with 0 severance. And you, Richard, will retire by the end of the month." David staggered back against the glass wall of the boardroom, his mouth open, looking at his father as if he were watching an empire turn to ash in real time. Richard didn't look at his son. He slowly reached out, unscrewed the cap of his fountain pen, and signed his name at the bottom of the ledger. The transition of power was executed with the total silence that defines my corporate strategy. There were no press releases, no loud celebrations. By Monday morning, the Vanguard logo replaced the Sterling name on every commercial sign at the Meridian Ridge Pavilion. It has been a full year since that day in the boardroom. The gated community is now fully occupied, but the families who live there don't pay their community fees to Sterling Development. They pay them to my holding trust. The old Sterling Manor was quietly sold to an international hospitality group 3 months ago. It is currently being converted into a luxury boutique hotel. David didn't stay in the county. Without his father's name to back his debts, his country club credit lines collapsed within weeks. The last I heard from my legal team, he had moved to a smaller state out west, working as an independent auto insurance claims adjuster, living in a rented studio apartment near the highway. Yesterday evening, I walked out to the western ridge of my restoration yard. The sun was setting, casting a deep, golden light over the rows of antique stone arches and vintage timber that my grandfather had spent his life protecting. My phone vibrated in my jacket pocket. It was an email from the trust department. Richard Sterling's personal health insurance liquidation request had cleared my corporate compliance desk. He needed an exemption from the commercial lease penalty to cover his long-term care facility expenses. I looked down at the signature at the bottom of the digital file, the same name that had once commanded millions, now begging for a routine waiver from a woman he used to sit at the edge of his kitchen doors. I clicked the approval button, not out of pity and certainly not out of family loyalty. I approved it because a true artisan knows that when a structure is completely broken, you don't keep kicking the ruins. You simply build something beautiful over the ground where it used to stand. Thank you for staying through the entire extended journey tonight on Silent Storm Stories. If you listened to every single minute of this massive multi-part account, do me a final favor. Drop the words, Silent Storm, in the comments section below so I know who our core community members are. Sleep well, keep your family records transparent, and never let anyone else define your place at the head of the table.